If I may just highlight certain points that you made. I thought your final proposals were excellent. And it's interesting that the very conservative Germans, who we all love criticize, have actually got a temporary jobs tax credit. They are actually subsidizing people who stay in part-time work quite heavily, and it's one of the reasons why they've kept unemployment quite low, though they impose a lot of unnecessary unemployment in other countries, but they have done that. And the French have also developed quite interesting schemes of subsidizing SMEs and so on. So I think that is one of the many powerful ideas that you presented. The other idea you said, it's not so easy for the government to increase spending when you're talking about the Obama plan. And I think that is one of the big problems of these kind of neoliberal policies, they leave governments without instruments. For example, the US doesn't have an infrastructure bank, and now there's some talk about it. Europeans actually have the European Investment Bank. It's done actually quite a good job, but it should do much more. But you need to have instruments in place that you can use. It's too late to kind of reinvent them in the crisis. And people forget that, and that's why we wrote this book that I'm advertising a little bit outside, Time for the Visible Hand, which is we did with Stiglitz and Ocampo, which is saying it's very clear as a result of the crisis that we need government instruments. And the last thing from what you said that is interesting, particularly for me, is that you said the government highlighted the green shoots too early. And I think that's a really good point. But the problem is twofold, because you're depending for the whole dynamism of your economy in the private sector, so you're trying to kind of encourage them. And particularly for countries like this one, and to a certain extent in the United States, the model is so dependent on these famous bond vigilantes, we now call them. So you're trying to say, everything's fine, even if it isn't. So I think the logic of whereby whole economies and countries are dependent on international capital markets is very perverse, and we have to think about changing that. I don't think the regulations and all that, good as they are, have gone far enough of that. And I know this from many crises in developing countries, which I've studied, where countries are thrown on their knees because perceptions suddenly change. But to finish on this kind of more optimistic note, I want to say that if you had this conference in China or in Brazil or in India today, you would be hearing a positive story. And I think it's an interesting story even for us in Europe, which is to say that countries like China have actually, and even some African countries, are actually growing a lot. And I think the main reason for that is that they have followed, and they have continued to follow, not just in the first stage, very Keynesian policies. And they have expanded aggregate demand very rapidly. They've compensated for falls in exports by expanding domestic demand. They have used, where they have them, public development banks. China, but also India, which is not socialist, or Brazil, massive. And they are the ones that are lending. They don't have this problem of, a banking system that doesn't do its job. So I think these are interesting lessons as well. I think we have to start learning that we also need to learn from the developing world. They went through these crises in the past, so we can get all the negative lessons from them. They deregulated. They didn't supervise. And then, of course, immediately, a few years later, they had terrible crises, terrible falls of GDP, much bigger than even you have had. And then they learned, and to the extent that they have regulated better and kept their financial system simpler, they haven't had crises so much. So there is a way forward. There is an alternative. And the people who tell us that there isn't are just lying or ignorant. They don't know history. They don't know the history of these countries, and they don't know what's going on in the developing world. I think I should now stop speaking and ask for questions, comments from the public. If you can just...
I forgot to mention, part of our jobs plan was an effort to create jobs directly. The cheapest, most effective way to create a job is directly. The government just gives the money to local governments, community-based organizations who just create jobs for doing things that we have to do. And it would be visible. It also has the benefit that it's a program that you can keep going even after you get an aggregate recovery for many distressed areas, which are going to have high unemployment for many years to come, especially minority communities, but not only those. There's lots of areas that are hit by the auto crisis and other things. They're going to have high unemployment for as far as the eye can see and need help.
Thank you. Tom.
Our panelists for very stimulating presentations. Rather than a question, could I just make a couple of comments here? What I was sort of thinking about here was what might be called tasks and traps for progressives in this debate. And it does seem to me that the task, and this is something I've been talking about with colleagues in the hotel earlier, is this debate is being framed as extreme austerity versus austerity. I was watching David Dimbleby last night on the BBC in his question time. That's the British debate, it's the Irish debate, it's the American debate, everywhere. It's extreme austerity versus austerity. That's a losing proposition. Somehow, our task is to get a stimulus horse, a legitimate stimulus horse in this race, politically. And I like to frame it as it's got to be sustained, because that's the situation with such a desperate situation. It's got to be substantial, and it's got to be smart. The opposite of Larry Summers's targeted, temporary and timely, which is the wrong frame, and Summers has been wrong before, not for the first time, I guess. Now that then says, what are the obstacles here to this? And I think we really have a whole series of political obstacles, and Larry has sort of spoken eloquently and begun to map out that terrain of political obstacles. But then, of course, there's also the more political obstacles. We could go on further about sort of public understandings and so on. And then we could go on also that there's intellectual obstacles. I mean, the economics profession is monolithic. I mean, Larry talked about Keynesians being marginalized. That's an understatement of how bad the situation is. So there's and this is where our work, we have an intellectual piece of this work, and then how to diffuse it is very difficult because we don't have the infrastructure that's needed to do that type of diffusion. But then there's some traps here as well. And I see two traps. The big trap is that fiscal stimulus alone is not enough. We're talking about a bigger problem, and I think that's what I will talk about tomorrow, late tomorrow afternoon, when I talk about paradigm change. And Paul's talk sort of really got to that. There's more needed to policy than just fiscal stimulus. And we sell ourselves short, and we actually create a problem if we do frame it entirely in terms of fiscal stimulus, even if it be very substantial, very sustained fiscal stimulus. The second trap is that I don't think we want to get into the situation that deficits of no consequence. That's a sort of a form of vulgar Keynesianism that I think we want to escape. We're sophisticated Keynesians. And so I would say this series of tasks and traps, therefore, is very tricky work.
Thank you very much. Who would like to speak next, please?
My name is Dieter Wenecke. I'm a member of the board of TASC. Two remarks. First, recovery. I agree with you that recovery probably gives you a certain vision of looking backwards. Where do you want to recover? Is it not more that we should talk about looking forward, progress, innovation, professional training? That's the first point. So I think progress is much more important than recovery. Second point, which is certain critics, I mean, Ireland is still, and we see it by the participants here, looking towards the United States. We had here that the Irish economy is much closer to Boston than to Berlin. But I won't say Berlin now, because I heard this critic, which I find in economic terms not very adequate, that Germany is creating unemployment in other countries. Excuse me. Do you accuse China as well in that?
Sure.
No, because
I'm
the
talking about
others are not innovative enough, and there is no competition between the industrial products, for example, of Germany and Ireland. I think Ireland should look much more than, instead of looking to Germany or the United States, to smaller countries like Denmark, like Chile, for example. You mentioned, I think with every reason, Brazil as well. But Brazil is another big country which has much more possibilities for the internal demand to maintain it. So I think that taking the example of smaller countries, Finland, Denmark, or even Malawi, you know, it's not that only the big countries have problems, the small countries have problems as well. And I think the orientation is much more towards countries which are putting more emphasis in progress and not in looking what have we, well, it's fine to look back, what have we done wrong. But I think the measures towards progress in the future, like professional training, like innovation, is much more important. What you mentioned, with all the reasons, I mean, we have growth in the United States, but it's not employment creating growth for the moment. It might come later. But I think what is very important is to get a better basis for more employment and more innovative employment, and not just doing the traditional thing.
Can I just very quickly clarify? What I was referring to is the fact that, well, that I think Germany has more space for fiscal policy that is less, that the budget cuts, you know, were perhaps good for you, but I'm sure that they're having an inflationary effect for the rest of Europe. And secondly, that the stance taken by the current Merkel government and the way they delayed helping, for example, Greece, helped, you know, deepen the crisis unnecessarily. And I think most progressives agree with that. And the Social Democrats are not in government, so it's a critique of a conservative government. And I think, because I think now this package that the Commission imposes or offers is actually more deflationary than what the IMF is currently offering. So if Ireland is forced to go somewhere, I would suggest they go to the IMF and not to the European Commission, because, you know, but I don't want to start a debate. I'm sorry.
But a booming Germany is good for the other European countries.
Of course.
And if you have
But
strikes
Germany,
in France, you can't expect that the economy is going up.
Exactly. Of course. Sorry.
Francesca Ross, I'm a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Socialists and Democrats group in the Parliament. The Parliament yesterday just approved, or day before yesterday, just approved two reports. One was the Perez report, Pervenche Perez, who in fact will be here this afternoon and in the morning. And I think it's important for us to take into account the European dimension, other than the Commission dimension. Because the Commission, in my view, is playing a particular role. The Commission and the Council are playing a particular role where they are determined not to waste a good crisis to drive an agenda that has been in place for 10 to 15 years now. And it seems to me that this sort of ideological, sort of driven sort of austerity is one that we need to get to grips with in Ireland. I think the second point I'd make is that we have to bear in mind that Ireland is part of the European Union, but it's only 1% of the population of Europe, and probably around that in terms of the European economy. And so the question is, how does an economy this small survive in a bigger economy, which is also being driven by austerity proposals, by and large, not in every case, but certainly those that are in difficulty are being driven to this austerity. So I think the policy dimension, the European policy dimension, in my view, has so far been ignored in the Irish debate, and I think that's it's something we do need to get to grips with. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps this afternoon, when Pervenche is here, it may be possible to do that. One of the proposals in the Pervenche Perez report, and bear in mind the Perez report is now the European Parliament report, it was adopted by a strong majority of across centre-right and centre-left. So it's quite a strong statement of a Parliament's view, representing the citizens of Europe, that there should be a European debt agency, for instance, rather than depending on the IMF or some other such body, and that this would stabilise the debt problems of countries like Greece and like Ireland and Spain. So I think the big problem, in my view, at the European level is the absence of strong economic governance. But in addition to that, there are proposals now to strengthen that economic governance, but there is no democratic dimension to the economic governance that is being proposed. So I think this is a debate that we really need to get to grips with now, because for whatever may emerge in the Irish economy or the European economy over the next year or two, what we put in place in legislative terms at European level would be a straitjacket for the member states, including Ireland, for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Thank you very much for raising that really important dimension. I think that Gustav, and I think again more than they need to, is going to be very bad, because if Ireland was cutting in an expanding European economy, as you said rightly, this wouldn't be such a problem. But if everybody's cutting, it's going to be a very big problem for everybody. And I think I'm very grateful that you raised it. But maybe we already have 3 very good questions and comments. Would you like to make comments?
Well, they're really mainly comments that you people have made, so there's little that I can add. I think Tom Paley's points on the traps are very important for people who like to see themselves as progressives, because sometimes you undo the case you make with not recognizing problems. And, deficits do matter, as you said. Fiscal stimulus is not enough. Now, in a small open economy, we have a particular problem with the stimulus. I personally don't think we can have a stimulus in Ireland, which you'll see this will cause a debate. But what I do believe, and this is where I think a lot of the stuff is about questions of degree, I think you can deflate too far. In fact, Congress is going to produce what is essentially an economic plan, which will be broadly neutral but slightly stimulatory. But what the Irish government is going to propose, it depends on how badly they cut, but on how they do it, because how you cut and how you tax is very important on the economic impact. But from what we're hearing, they're going to shave another 3, maybe 4%. If the fiscal hawks get their way, and they seem to be in the ascendant and dominating here. So I think we're going into a decade of decline. And Proncius's point is Europe, in spite of the collapse of the neoliberal stuff, Europe is dominated by right-wing parties, and they run the Commission, and they're embedding down. It's like 100 years of Fianna Fáil. The administration in Ireland is sort of Fianna Fáil now, and it's going to be very hard to undo. But in the meantime, we're going to suffer terribly, and there'll be the social Europe is looking less and less likely at the moment.
Thank you, Larry.
Nothing can be more infuriating to me. Look at the United States situation, to see the party that was behind the deregulation, laissez-faire, 30-year period of the rape of the American working class and the cause of the financial crisis, to actually get put back in power because of the full extent of the damage that they themselves created, but managed to somehow blame the president for. And I think there's a lot of reflection in Europe has to come about. Why is it that we have the most obvious failure of capitalism that finds the left not advantaged one iota politically, and I think that requires some explanation. I agree with a lot of the comments. The looking forward business, just to comment a bit, it's always been one of the challenges because if you're dissatisfied the way the economy was even before the recession, then you want to try to rebuild it on a different basis. But it's also true that if you're so steeped in unemployment and if you are responsive to the needs of the people, you know, the first order of business has to be trying to help people get to the other side of this, and also hopefully rebuilding something even better. But I think it's a very hard thing to combine both, but it's an important task. The part that we focused on is that what helped get us to this crisis was the fact that in the United States, and I think it's true elsewhere, that American workers didn't benefit from the growing productivity of the prior 30 years. That productivity grew 80% and hourly compensation grew around 6% for the typical worker. And if that's the way you were building an economy, you can only grow based on debt and asset bubbles. So now to come out and have a robust recovery again, we have to challenge and fix that wage-setting mechanism, but that's a hard thing to do in the middle of a recession, and to raise that. So I mean, I think about those points. And there's also the climate change and many other things we also have to deal with, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Larry. Yeah, I think the climate change was something that you rightly raised now that we haven't raised, where you could combine recovery, investing in clean energy, with changing the model. And that could be an interesting way forward. I think we have a lot of people wanting to comment.
Greener from the New Economics Foundation. I've got a couple of questions, but the conference I think will be interested to hear that I'm told that in the Library of the Treasury in London is a copy of a pamphlet by Keynes that's had scrawled all over it the words bankruptcy and insanity by Treasury officials. So I think your point about Keynes being marginalised has probably been true for about 70 years in London. So, but the questions were to Paul. We're constantly trying to sort of argue for the strong re-regulation of the financial sector and the corporate sector to a degree. But the favourite trick of banks in particular in London is to claim that they will simply leave and go somewhere else. I'm just interested in how that, whether the same threat is issued, in Ireland to the same degree, and what would be your response to that? And a question for Larry is, has there been any debate in the US about using quantitative easing to actually fund the stimulus package directly rather than indirectly through buying gilts and then issuing, treasury bonds and then issuing more treasury bonds to fund the stimulus? And one final comment, I think it's interesting, whereas in the States the current administration has been blamed for the failure, I'd say in the UK our government's been much cleverer in making sure it blamed the previous government's overspending for the current deficit, and that has drowned out the fact that it's really the collapsing tax revenues from the recession which was caused by the financial sector deregulation, the things that have been described earlier on. And so it's a real battle there to change the narrative back to one that focuses on nailing this sort of free market myth of deregulation as being the cause of the problem.
Suggestion, I assume you're talking about $2 billion per annum from the pension fund. And I agree entirely with you that stimulus is needed. But a question for you, what is your notion of developing indigenous enterprise around, for example, the export capacity? And how would the trade union movement engage with that, or how can it assist or help in that debate? Particularly in view of the fact that the social partnership has collapsed and is likely to remain off the stage for some considerable time. And I know that was your own part of your own presentation, but I'm dwelling on Paul, I suppose, just because of his indigenous expertise locally here. But if you have any comment to make on it, very much welcome that as well. Thanks.
From the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I just want to provide a Canadian perspective on the financial dimension of the crisis, to say that we didn't experience the financial collapse that was experienced elsewhere, including Ireland and the United States. Although the government had to put in place a huge safety net, almost $200 billion safety net, so that it wouldn't fall along with other financial sectors. And the reason for that is that the Canadian financial sector was strongly regulated. And the regulators, for the most part, did their job, and the politicians supported them. And it's not because, as I've heard say, that there was a kind of a culture of prudence amongst bankers, because there was a lot of pressure to deregulate amongst the banking community. They were hugely angry when the finance minister didn't let the big banks merge, for example, or when they tried to get the foreign investment restrictions lifted. So there are huge restrictions on the entry of foreign banking into the Canadian economy. I found it also interesting that, for example, at the WTO and in the financial services part of those negotiations, they were holding Canada up as an example of financial openness and liberalization as the way to go and as a rationale for continuing to open up financial services worldwide. So I just wanted to make that comment and say finally that the current government that we have, which is a hard-right conservative government, sort of George Bush delayed, and if they had been in power, and they had already started when they came to power in 2006 to deregulate the financial sector, fortunately the crisis I shouldn't say fortunately the crisis intervened, but if the crisis had happened later, I think we would have been every bit as vulnerable. And that this is a government that has, as you know, the last G20 meeting was in Ottawa, and our Prime Minister was a major force behind the move to get a consensus around fiscal consolidation, and also in a major factor in scuttling the bank tax. So just wanted to add those comments.
Important point about financial regulation, because in the Anglo-Saxon world, meaning particularly the US and the UK and here, it's kind of portrayed like it's very difficult to regulate because the system is so complex and you're always gaming the system. But what I like about the Canadian example is that actually with a few simple rules, like the ones you pointed out, but also the limited leverage of investment banks. Whereas in the US, of course, they liberalized it under Bush. They limited in Canada how much the mortgages should be as proportion of the value of the house. I mean, all these things that are kind of almost up to a point. They're almost like economics 101, as they say in the States. A first-year student could design. And these are the kind of things they do in developing countries. And these are the things that used to be done in the 50s and the 60s in the US and in Europe. You can actually prevent these crises, that it's not so complicated. And that the complexity is actually a way of capture by the financial sector. Say, oh, it's too complicated, you can't understand, let us use our models so we can fiddle things so that we can make more money. And that there is this alternative path. And I think that's, for looking ahead, in a lot of these things, is actually quite kind of comforting that these models exist. Sorry, I mustn't talk too much. I think we had people here on this side.
Queen's University, Belfast. There's been lots of talk rightly about global issues, the World Trade Organisation, World Bank, the EU, and national level. I'd like to bring it down to the possibilities at the more local level, in terms of municipalities or local authorities being able to, of course, the issues are about the legal competence of that level of government in responding imaginatively financially. I'm thinking here, last week Birmingham Council, one of the largest owners and suppliers of housing in Europe, has announced a local Green New Deal. 100 million retrofitting 10,000 houses and all the associated jobs, shovel-ready. This is a triple win. We combat fuel poverty, we reduce CO2 emissions, and these are non-outsourceable jobs. And so actually whether we should start integrating into our analysis the possibility of what the New Economics Foundation have been campaigning on for a number of years, of this Green New Deal, but shift the focus to the municipal level. And certainly it's been experienced in America in the past about raising bonds at that level. I know Paul mentioned the idea of the solidarity bond, even though what resulted was rather misshapen from what the original expectation was. But I do think there are definite possibilities of responding in magnitude by looking at that municipal and local level. And I certainly know the European Investment Bank seems to be quite open to the possibility of countries in Europe at that local level being able to access funds in a more imaginative way through the issue of local government bonds, partly being perhaps either backed by maybe pension schemes or indeed the energy savings you recoup as you do a retrofit programme.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'm here in an individual capacity. My question, which I suspect may not be very popular, is really about the way the whole problem is being framed. And it was already mentioned that about bank deregulations and the fiscal problems and the deficit. And for me, this is actually the way part of the problem, that it is seen as only superficial problems, if you like, though grave enough that they are, that can be fixed by through Keynesian intervention. But for me, it doesn't actually address the fundamental problem that the system that is in operation with capitalism, that has inherent problems, and if anything, actually, Keynesian economics is going to, if anything, exacerbate it by developing and expanding the deficit and the gap in expenditure. So, is this not the perfect opportunity, if you like, to take advantage of this situation? And I'm not in any way trying to minimize the problems facing that kind of approach, to take advantage of the situation and tackle the fundamental root causes of the problem, rather than trying to put a band-aid on the problem, if you like. Thank you.
Nora Owen is my name, retired politician. I agree with the comment made earlier by Arthur Morgan. We are being hoisted on our own petard at the moment. Tom made the point that it's austerity versus extreme austerity, and the more passion you can get into those words, you're kind of taken more seriously. But of course, here in Ireland, in about July or August every year prior to the budget, the spin started about how absolutely appalling it was going to be, how the ministers were tearing their hair out trying to find savings and all the cuts. And by the time the budget came and you did your calculation and you were €5 down or €10 down, a lot of money to some people, people said, phew, it's not so bad. So maybe the debate we're having now might change the language of how we deal with budgets and the pre-budget period, so people are told the truth and get it right. I went to see Enron recently, and there was a panel discussion. That's a play on at the moment in our festival, and there was a panel discussion beforehand, and I was profoundly depressed on the one hand and greatly heartened on the other when an economist said, I let you into a secret, we don't really know what went wrong, we don't really know what the answers are. And I was depressed on one hand and then pleased on the other, because us non-economists now can actually put the economists to the pin of their collar to tell us whether they really know what's happening. And so I want to ask Paul a question, because he's giving out about the opposition parties going along with the 4-year plan to 2014. What exactly is the advantage of making it 6 years? I just don't know whether those 2 extra years are going to be worth the trouble. And the other question is, what are the impediments that exist that stop getting people, particularly in the construction centre, back to work doing the many projects that have to be done? Isn't it better to have them working than paying them job seekers allowance? But there are impediments there, because every time I've talked about this to people in the construction industry, they say we can't get our hands on the work. So is it our method of tendering for the work? Is it the local authorities? What are the impediments there, and why the hell can't we get rid of them? It's better to have somebody working, paying taxes, than having somebody on job seekers. Thank you.
Gentleman with Deputy is my name. I act as an advisor on innovation and business networks. The point I want to make is I also am a member of TASC, which is the online community TASC operates. I think there are implications this morning for the agenda of TASC as well as more generally. And I think the big implication for me is that we need to bring these issues down to a more micro level. For example, on the demand side, we don't really know what the impact of changes in things like child benefit will be, because we don't know how that money is spent really. Similarly with other aspects of the social welfare budget. So we need to do more work and more analysis on how the demand side actually operates in Ireland. We might know in the US or Britain, we don't know in Ireland. Similarly on the supply side, we have, somebody already has mentioned innovation as a key issue. We could be looking in much more detail at what's happening in the Nordic countries with their national system of innovation. We don't have a national system of innovation in the Irish context. We've had a task force recently and various other things, but we don't really understand how this has been managed in other countries and what lessons we could learn in that area. Similarly, we had a digital hub in Dublin in the digital media area. So it's basically disappeared. We need to have these things if we're going to be part of the new developments that everybody's referring to. So I think there are big implications for the agenda on both the supply side and on the demand side.
Thank you very much. I think we have a last question because we're running out of time.
Just as the New Economics Foundation is here, and it was mentioned that we're into another round of quantitative easing. It seems that there is a question at the global level regarding the possible impact of a currency war between China and the US, and how that may impact on the Eurozone and the future of the Eurozone in the context of the end game of the currency war being potential trade embargoes and so forth.
It's a nice, simple question.
There's a lot of macroeconomics.
Very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, very briefly, just 2 points. First of all, it's been said that the stimulus in the United States was too small. And we talk about stimulus in Ireland. What would be a sufficient stimulus in Ireland to do the job that we need to do? And the second point relates to child benefit. Some years ago I was Minister for Social Welfare in Ireland. We launched a report on child benefit which identified the expenditure of child benefit, which it was found the vast majority of which was spent actually on children.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. Regardless of the income of the household, the money was spent on children. So I just make that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Victor.
What a task, and I suppose my questions are directed at Paul. Paul called for a review of corporate governance, and I wonder, there's another dog that hasn't barked in this debate, and that is our policy of attracting foreign direct investment, which seems to me, of course, it's been hugely important for the growth of our economy, but I think it's also been a fundamental factor in the push towards deregulation in our society. And I just don't hear people talking about are there limits to what we should as a nation offer foreign direct investors to invest in this country, and how should it, what should those limits be? The second issue, which I think along with many others have been very disappointed at the lack of focus on employment and unemployment and ways by government of trying to tackle the crisis. Very striking, Dan O'Brien's piece in the Irish Times today, some of you may have read, this annual Assembly of Economists in Kenmare. Unemployment was not formally on the programme, it wasn't discussed informally. So what is it about our economic community that Is it because emigration has taken care of our unemployment problems for so long that this is not a worthy subject of study for our economic community? Or, how do we, and this is a question for TASC, how do we get employment stimulus on the agenda of a much wider section of our society than simply government?
90% of bonds cut in relation with the foreign investment. If you do that, think of Argentina, what happened there when they cut that. And we can't get out of the Eurozone. I mean, if we had another currency, it would be much easier just to devalue and then cut it. But I think it would be probably the worst solution to get out of the Eurozone, like we have discussed that about Greece. This is a too easy situation. Now, what you say about the prices are going down, if the prices really should go down more, and in comparison to the continental prices still are very high here, then you would get an indirect effect on the income of the broader population. Because if the prices are going down, and even if their salaries are going down, they have the same demand internally. And I think we are discussing here too little about the accelerator, which is coming from the internal demand. We are discussing too much about the multiplier, which is coming from investments.
The dangers of debt restructuring, but just for the record, as a Latin American expert, I should say that Argentina actually started to grow when it stopped paying its debt. It's had a lot of other problems, but it actually grew. You have to be a little bit careful. But anyway, I would like to. You have a lot of questions, and is 5 minutes enough?
Try and regulate the financial sector. The companies threaten to leave, and you know what happens here, because I've heard it. They all say, with our low regulation and low taxes, they'll come here, and as you know, some of them have come here. So it's competitive downbidding. It's a race towards the bottom, and really it comes back to Europe. Really, we have to coordinate and work together to regulate. I actually think, and I think I said it in the presentation, you might have picked it up, I think at an international level there is greater cooperation. It's better than I thought it would be, but maybe other people have views on that. Arthur Morgan, front-loading, as you said, it frightens you more than other things, and I think you're right. I do think they're probably overplaying it, so that we'll, as I think Nora said, that we'll breathe a sigh of relief and say it isn't too bad. And so there's a psychological as well as an economic and social game being played. And it's very dishonest. And the way we do budgets in Ireland, this secrecy, obsessive secrecy, and lack of transparency is an issue we have to come to terms with, and hopefully a new government will deal with that. On indigenous industry and growing it, what do trade unions? Well, we think it's very important. And Nora actually asked a question related as well on this. Which, construction jobs, or was it Nora? But it's an interesting thing. Listening to the media, you think that Ireland, every single job in Ireland was dependent on FDI. But I'm not dead sure on this, but I'm pretty sure that Irish firms employ more people abroad than foreign firms employ here. Now, there's a qualitative difference in the type of jobs. We usually, our firms buy firms there. The firms that come here, like Intel and Microsoft, are setting up very innovative, high productivity, enormous productivity, if you're to read the figures. But we have, I'm a bit worried whether Ireland has a good indigenous sector or not, because the guys who ran the banks that we see in TASC's mapping the Golden Circle, just look at where they are. they're the captains of industry. I mean, one of them led the IBEC delegation in, and we were negotiating the last agreement, and he's a big manufacturer all over the world, particularly in South America, Colombia. And, you know, you wonder, are they actually all crooks and property speculators or what? But actually they're not. There's some very good Irish companies. And I think, personally, we've got to focus a bit more to the indigenous, particularly if these markets, as they keep talking about, are so fearsome. Because I actually am beginning to wonder, do I live in a market or do I live in a democracy? And certainly, if any Martian came down, they'd think we all live in a market. And that's a really serious issue. And I think even conservatives have to ask that question. By the way, TASC is going to do a major study of industrial policy, including services and so on, and I think that will be useful because it's not going to be every government study that's done that. Transfer pricing is not on the agenda, and the TASC study hopefully will be a real study. Let me see. I won't answer every question to give others a chance. The person who said capitalism is the problem, I have great sympathy with you. It's a very imperfect system. I myself was a revolutionary for many years. What changed me, the road to Damascus, my name is Paul, was when I read that the Bolsheviks, there were a lot of things, but this was the one, the revolution's very imperfect. In 1927, half of the Bolshevik party members were dead, and it wasn't by natural causes. You know, they turned on themselves, and that's not just Stalin, it's many others as well. Our good friend Mugabe, not that he was a revolutionary, but... okay, Ruth Barrington's questions, I thought, were again about FDI attraction and are we going too far? That comes back to the indigenous, the importance of Irish indigenous industry. And an interesting thing, which I'm going to actually find out in the next few weeks about, is Ireland per capita is the second biggest exporter of services in the world, and even as a little country, we're the 9th biggest in the world. And my question that I'm getting answered by talking to a number of the agencies is how much of it's indigenous? Is it just Microsoft packages or whatever? But I think a good bit's indigenous. It has a very low import content, and it's very skill intensive. It's an area to watch. Unemployment and Ken Mayer. Well, I was asked repeatedly why I don't go to Ken Mayer. I think it's because my blood pressure would explode. Because it comes back, I think, we'll probably discuss it. I think Larry said it about the way economics is taught worldwide. It's very, very narrow. They don't even study economic history, which I had to study and I think is really important. They do study, I think, the history of economic thought, which is different than economic history. But they don't learn. It's terribly mathematical and they abstract away the real world. I think there is a fundamental problem in the economics profession worldwide, and it needs to be redressed, like some of the other big problems we've discussed, regulation and so on. But it's not being discussed in Ireland. It's the neoclassical school. I was taught it. If something went wrong with me, I think it's because I worked for a few years before I went to college. But it's very elegant, and it answers quite a lot of questions, but you know, it's highly deficient, and it is naturally right-wing. And the fact that they're not discussing unemployment, I think that tells all, really.
For Pastor Larry, two points that I thought were really important, and if I can just highlight them. One is, you said, do I live in a democracy or do I live in a market economy? And I think that is just so important because these markets, financial markets, are totally unaccountable to anybody. These are young yuppies, you know, nobody elected them who can, at the pressing of a button, wreck economies. And I think there's something deeply flawed about it. people talk about the markets as if they exist, like a natural disaster, but we can actually, we created them and we can modify them, and people like yourselves have that power. So we have to challenge at that very deep level the value of financial markets. And on economics, I think there are alternative thinking. I'm just in defense of economics, you know. There is Keynes, there is Stiglitz, Krugman, and a lot of, you know, good alternative economists. It's how somehow their thoughts can influence policy making, how they can, you know, it's appalling that employment, which is the main objective. But just to cheer you up, I was at a conference between the IMF and the ILO, first event, and Strauss-Kahn and Somavia were sitting there together saying that they're going to work together. And of course it was partly a political event, but you know, there is some hope. And I think this is what the road is. But Larry has much more interesting things to say, so I'll give you the...
One of our mottos at the Economic Policy Institute is that our job is to keep the world safe from economists. And we need a lot more staff to do it too. Don't advertise that back home. Some of the prestigious economists wouldn't like me to say that. That I like to work with sometimes. Quantitative easing, I might defer to Tom, who's probably more of a monetary expert than I, but there is more discussion right now about what they're calling quantitative easing 2, having done quantitative easing 1. And I think the fear is that the scale of quantitative easing that's needed to have an effect that they won't do as much as needed. I think Tom actually thinks it's being mistaken because there's a lot more quantitative easing. One of the things I want to comment on is the political incompetence of our team. I'm a trade union economist when I was a young man, and we were taught never to bargain with yourself. You don't come, make a demand, and then come back the next time and lower your demand unless you get something for it. But President Obama, every time he does something, he gives the Republicans, here's what you want, now will you agree with me with what I want? And they never do it, of course. You know, he lets them do offshore drilling, gives them nuclear power, and says, now would you like to do energy alternatives? You know, hey, I want to do a stimulus plan. You can have $250 billion of tax cuts. Would you agree with the rest of my plan? And the answer is no. And so, you know, some of what we have is political incompetence. Local government was raised. I think that would be a really important thing. I just don't know whether it adds up to a national recovery. I think dealing with climate change is really important, but one of the things that it's never easy, if you believe that fundamental to climate change, and I do believe this, that the policies is we have to raise the price of carbon, that although sometimes the left postures as if there's no big adjustment, there's no downside adjustments, there's just huge downside adjustments to energy intensive industries. And so doing that in the context of a very deep recession is... but also positive. You can do... No, they only talk about the positive. It's all gains, no losses, right? All the jobs we're going to gain from dealing with it, but they never acknowledge the losses. Well, really, the people, when you do the legislation, are pretty well aware of the losses, and it's really hard to do in a recession. So it makes it hard for it to be a tool for getting out of a recession, at least politically. In China, we can have debates about it, but I'm for actually retaliatory tariffs if China doesn't deal with the exchange rates, and that putting it bluntly out there, and in fact, Paul Krugman estimates that the maladjustment of exchange rates is lowering world GDP by 1%. So that's really something to do, and the recent even raising of interest rates in China shows they're going in exactly the wrong direction. I'm for detailing root causes, but I do, I have come to believe in my old age. I mean, I don't know what there is other than capitalism. There's just various types of capitalism. And if we want to make capitalism the problem, then we have to be able to articulate what is the thing other than capitalism that we can get to. And the fact is, there's just various types of ways of constraining and markets and shaping them, and we should. But essentially, if we're going to live in a market system, I'm not sure, and I think we will be, and probably should be. I'm not sure, what something other than capitalism actually looks like, and so I don't know whether capitalism in itself, other than its tendencies, should be the object of discussion.
Thank you very much. Before giving the final word to our first speaker, Francois, I just want to say on China, I must say I disagree, because I think that the only thing that has not happened like the 30s is we haven't had major protections, and if we start playing with that, I think we're really in tricky territory.
Inflating your exchange rate is protectionism.
Well, they're also financing your deficit, so until you get it under control, you have to be nice to them.
They pay our deficit because we take that's a consequence of the trade deficit, not of our fiscal deficit. We have
the trade deficit.
Right. If we didn't have a huge trade deficit with China, we wouldn't be taking in their money for the bonds.
Exactly.
So
but I mean, if you save when you start saving more, and, getting your house more in order, then you won't need so much Chinese money. And
we don't need
under Bush, they didn't worry about the deficit, and they had, this was not the case with the Democrats, but they became dependent on China. But anyway, this is another debate.
Yes.
But I think Francois will just round up for us. Thank you.
I'm coming here as a European citizen, informed about what's going on, especially in this financial crisis, but not mastering all the concepts behind it. So I think that what has been said about by Larry about the ideological incompetence that we have as progressives to explain what, why, and how what we are doing is important and is benefiting for jobs and for economy is a part of the explanation also. And in Brussels, in the Brussels bubble, there's been a lot of debate about why didn't the progressive movement benefit from this so-called window of opportunity that the financial and economic crisis have put on the table, because a number of our values, of our concepts have been re-established. And I think that this explanation part of the debate is a part of the explanation. It was also interesting to hear our colleague, I should remember your name, about the just tell us how these 2 years can make a difference. We're talking a lot about concepts like social justice, like economic recovery, and your arguments on recovery, meaning going back to something we had instead of just trying to move forward and offering maybe a new model of development for the next 20 years to come, is also an interesting dimension. So the language, the semantics, the psychological dimension that also you put on the table, I think are crucial also in this debate. And what we have learned, I think, with this financial crisis and economic crisis is that non-economists, that just average citizens can have a way of changing things, because they can get a grip on what are the main issues and the main policies and what's backing the policies on that. And this is where I think as progressive we have a crucial role on that, in this explanation. And this is what you put all on the table at a certain level. So social justice as the solution and not as the problem, that's an incantation, but social justice is not a very concrete element. And someone was putting on the table the local level, which is often also the first level where policies are taken on the ground and put into implementation. This is also maybe something that we could, as progressives, try and explain a bit more. It is difficult for an average citizen to get a grip to what's being dealt at the international level and in the international arenas, even if, as you said, it might be possible that there is more cooperation on that level as you could find or see at the European level, for instance. But this explanation effort, I think, is absolutely crucial. And giving the little elements to the people so that they can make the broader picture is something that we should put a particular focus on. So this is a little bit what I wanted to say as
Thank you very
a
much.
final
Thank
point.
you. I think Paul's been reminded, and he wants to make
Yeah,
a
sorry,
half a minute.
Nora's question about why the 2 years. There are two reasons. One is, the first one is honesty. It can't be done in 4 years. Unfortunately, I don't like saying this, I'm not supposed to be political, but the main political parties are being dishonest with the people, and they know really that it can't be met. And if you even read the speech by Brian O'Lenihan that was in yesterday's Irish Times, he's kind of being slightly ambiguous on it. So, you know, if it can't be done, now that it's the EU, and it's right that we do try and get rid of the deficit as best we can and as fast as we can indeed. But it's become an obsession. It's an artificial target. It's imposed upon us by EU. I think it's going to make EU unpopular with the citizens of Ireland, and I'm a big European. The second reason is it'll hurt too much.
Thank you very much.
If it had been said
no,
it was 6
I think-
years, would people have said it should have been 8? You know, that
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Thanks for the very good questions and comments. And I understand lunch is now available.